There's a lot to be said for Franklin in that regard. His defense of commercial society, the Greeks, the Christians, most philosophers were anti-capitalist, and he was pro-capitalist.
A podcast presented by the Investor Choice Advocates Network. This is Capital Ideas.
Welcome to another episode of Capital Ideas, where we explore the innovation that enriches our lives and the capital markets that turn those ideas into reality. I'm Nick Morgan, co-host of Capital Ideas and founder of the Investor Choice Advocates Network.
I'm Mark Uriety, co-host of Capital Ideas and senior legal director and policy counsel at ICANN.
And I'm Dara Albright, co-host of Capital Ideas and a very proud board member of ICANN. As we approach the 250th anniversary of America, for the special Independence Day episode, Capital Ideas wanted to celebrate our founding fathers who laid the foundation for America's transformation from a vast farmland into the greatest economic superpower in the history of the world. So joining us today for this discussion is Mark Skousen. Mark is an American economist, university professor, he's an investor, best-selling author, and he's recognized as one of the top 20 most influential living economists. Mark is also a direct descendant of one of our most influential founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. Mark is the author of the book, The Greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, the world's most versatile genius. And so Mark is uniquely positioned to really discuss how Franklin's ideas help shape America's rise and its financial infrastructure. So with that, Mark, welcome to Capital Ideas. It's so honored to have you on.
Sarah, it's a real pleasure, along with another Mark and Nick. I assume I'm going to be thrown with a lot of questions, so let's get started.
Excellent. So, Mark, your book argues that Benjamin Franklin wasn't simply a founder. He was really one of the history's great economic architects. And one thing that struck me is that long before public markets even existed, Franklin seemed to understand that prosperity depends on the financial infrastructure. So maybe you could start by talking a little bit about how Benjamin Franklin helped lay the groundwork for the modern capital markets.
Yeah, I think first of all that everyone should realize that Benjamin Franklin had a unique approach to his philosophy of life. And one is that he supported commercial society. One could even say speculation and taking risk and being an entrepreneur. He was all of those things. And that's really important, because you have to have the right cultural element to create a sound financial infrastructure that you're talking about, because you're talking about an era which was just budding in terms of financial infrastructure. I mean, there really weren't any commercial banks to speak of. In other words, making deposits, savings accounts, CDs, investing in the stock market. Yes, there was a growing bond market, primarily government gilts in Britain and so forth. And there were individual banks, but the Bank of North America, which was the first central bank, in my opinion, but it was privately run, set up by Robert Morris, that wasn't until 1781. And so you have to understand that this is just an early phase, but you need that cultural development, that defense of commercial society that Ben Franklin supported, as did Robert Morris and others, but others did not. Thomas Jefferson was famous for being anti-banking and against paper money completely. He wanted only gold and silver. Franklin is the most modern of the founders, because Franklin envisioned a dynamic commercial society that was stable, that was beneficial, that could get carried away. Yes, speculation could get carried away. He engaged in several speculations himself with the Ohio Valley, trying to buy huge swaths of land, as did George Washington and other founders. He was very much a part of that. It was a failed enterprise, by the way. So he had a lot of experience in the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat in terms of his defense of commercial society. But he liked big cities. He wasn't a fan of the small town. When he returned from London back to Philadelphia, he said, well, this is a small town. I'm used to the big cities and the vibrancy of London and Paris. And he was a world traveler, international, which is really valuable in terms of trying to create a sound banking system. So I think that that's the first thing I want to emphasize, his defense of commercial society. You know, the Greeks, the Christians, most philosophers were anti-capitalist, and he was pro-capitalist. So there's a lot to be said for Franklin in that regard. So maybe that would be my general introduction to him. He's actually listed as to there's a book called The 101 Greatest Philosophers in History, and he's one of them because he's the only one defending commercial society. So saving, investing, speculating, that was always viewed as a sinful exercise. Franklin was not a puritanical type of person. He was much broad-leveled, a modern thinker in so many ways.
Well, Mark, we can learn so much from studies of history, and particularly your study of Ben Franklin's work on paper currency. Of course, we're on the verge of replacing paper currency now with digital assets. We have the Genius Act that's been enacted governing stablecoin issuances, and we may have more legislation, the Clarity Act, regulating digital assets. You write that colonial America suffered severe liquidity constraints because Britain restricted the flow of gold and silver. And Franklin didn't just advocate for paper money, he actually printed it. And I think he invented anti-counterfeiting techniques. So what was so revolutionary in your mind about Franklin's approach to money, and what impact did it have on economic growth in the colonies?
So first of all, Franklin was a very successful publisher and printer, as you know, in Philadelphia. So successful that he retired at the age of 42. It was during this time period when he published the Philadelphia Gazette that he published a pamphlet supporting the printing of money. This was controversial at the time. Most of the thinkers at the time were gold and silver advocates, hard money, fearful of paper money, fearful of counterfeiting, which is easy to do with paper money because it only costs a few cents to print per bill, and then you stamp on it $20 or 20 pounds or what have you. The British pound was and the Spanish dollar were the two currencies at the time during this time period. So Franklin was the first crony capitalist, as you noted, because he got the contract from the legislature to print the paper money. But he was fearful of counterfeiting. You know, counterfeiting was a capital offense. You could be put to death for counterfeiting because counterfeiting was so easy to do. So they had to put on a major punishment. But even then, Franklin did a smart thing. Was he developed as an innovator. He was one of the greatest inventors that America has ever produced. He created these leaves that he would put on the printing press. And the image of the leaf was very difficult to imitate because every leaf is different. So it was a very smart move on his behalf. He was the first person also to design the first coin, a dollar coin, which was in bronze, not gold or silver, bronze. And below it says, mind your business. Mind your business. But at any rate, he was an inflationist to some extent because of the British prohibiting American mining companies and mints from minting their own gold and silver coins. So they had to use the British sovereigns and the coinage at that time. And you'll see, if you look at documents, you'll see everything in pounds during that time period. In fact, when Franklin gave in his will, he gave 1,000 pounds to Boston and to Philadelphia. That was 1,000 pounds, not dollars. It'd be about like $5,000 today. But in any case, he advocated the printing of money, and he said at the end of his life, after the hyperinflation of the Continental becoming not worth the Continental, they had serious runaway inflation. as a result of the American Revolution. And he performed beautifully, by the way, as a diplomat in dealing with the French and and being able to sell all these loans in dollars to the French. Well, it was actually he borrowed money in the French currency at the time, but he said in small amounts, inflation, the printing of money, paper money, is a good thing. It stimulates the economy. It's kind of a Real Bills Doctrine. I don't know if you're familiar with the Real Bills Doctrine, but the Real Bills Doctrine says you issue currency equal to the needs of the trade and not beyond that. So if trade is expanding, you expand the money supply, but only equal to the amount of the trade. So if GDP is growing 4%, you increase the money supply 4%, not more than that. It's called the Real Bills Doctrine. And he was an advocate of that. But then he said, but I realize now, having lived through the runaway inflation of the American Revolution, which also almost bankrupted the country, he realized that it was not a good thing and it was used excessively. I will point out, however, he did talk about a silver lining in the runaway inflation. He said all those farmers and tax evaders who refused to pay their fair share of the payments for the revolution, we got them to pay indirectly by depreciating their currency. So that was Dean's way of taxing people. I thought that was a pretty clever line.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think so? Obviously, he was attuned to the fact that when confidence in money breaks down, so does the ability to accumulate and deploy capital. He seems very aware of that sort of dynamic. Do you think,
Yes.
was he an early thinker on that, or were there earlier examples from European or Roman or earlier history, I suppose, of recognition of that connection?
Well, all paper money was based on governments having to issue bills of credit, and it was actually loans, but it didn't pay any interest. And so the original banknotes from the Bank of England and the creation of these central banks — America did not have a central bank at this time — was based on the needs of government more than the needs of credit. And so you did have problems of in essence, the clipping of the coins like it used to be in Roman times, except this time they just issued more paper money. And you had fractional reserve banking, and you did have banks develop in England at this time, but they were basically just serving the purpose of storing gold and silver, paper money, and facilitating credit or loans between individuals. So Franklin had several banks in England, but he only chose the most conservative banks. I would get back to his personal philosophy a little bit, because he advocated three grand principles that guided him and his country's finances: industry, thrift, and prudence. Industry, thrift, and prudence. And he advocated all three. He was very well diversified. So he avoided the banking crisis of 72, which devastated the American colonies as well as England. But he actually writes a friend and says, I avoided trouble because I had a well-diversified portfolio in bank stocks and in banks that were not subject to a run, he said. So that was really advantageous on his part. But this whole idea of prudence behavior, he once said, there's much revenue in economy. And what he meant by that is that if you save, penny saved is a penny earned concept, which he really promoted in Poor Richard's Almanac. He was a strong advocate of saving money on a regular basis, especially during the good times. So his idea of prudence was really important. And so getting back to your question about paper money, I think he was an early advocate of paper money. It was controversial at the time, but he won the day in getting the legislature to support the issuance of paper money. But when he was in France, there were touch and go situations. He was like 9 years as the ambassador to France, trying to get French support for the war. And so he constantly was borrowing money. And livre was the French currency at the time, and not the French franc. But he borrowed so much money at interest, so he offered to pay interest. At one point, he said, "Well, maybe we'll pay you interest in gold and silver," to get them to accept it, because to just accept credit in more paper money was not working with the French.
Yeah.
So there's this one time, I got to tell you one story that's really pretty interesting about Franklin, his diplomatic skills. He was extraordinary. And by the way, he had a policy of never speaking ill in public of any enemy. And so there's something that our president today could learn from the diplomacy of Ben Franklin.
Right.
I mean, he obviously had private views that were negative about certain people, but he would not speak publicly. And he wrote letters to people and complain to them, and then he'd tear up the letter and not mail it. But in any case, at one point, Robert Morris, who is the financier of the American Revolution, he writes to Franklin and says, "Listen, we need another 25 million livres." Now, this is near the end of the war. This is like in the 1781 or 82, after the Battle of Yorktown. But they still need more money. The Americans have run out of money, and they need more money, and the war is not completely over. And he says, "Dr. Franklin, can you please ask Vergennes and the King of France for 25 million livres?" And Franklin writes back and he says, "You got to be kidding. The French know that that we're broke, and we're not going to be able to pay back the principal, the interest, let alone the principal on all this debt." Morris writes him back and says, "Yeah, but if we don't get this 25 million, we're in big trouble." So finally, Franklin writes this letter in his best diplomatic skills. In his left hand, he writes this letter to Vergennes, the foreign minister, that's who he deals with. And he says, "Listen, I hate to do this, but we need to borrow another 25 million livres because, and look, if the British win this war, we're going to dominate you and both countries and the rest of the world for the next 100 years. So can you please loan us this money?" He sends the letter off, and in a week, no response. 2 weeks pass, no response. Finally, he writes another letter to Vergennes and says, "Did you get my email?" Kind of. And so Vergennes says, "Come to Versailles and let's talk." So Franklin immediately gets into his carriage and goes to Versailles. It's about an hour away. He arrives. He's welcomed into the room with Vergennes, but Vergennes is not smiling. He says, "Dr. Franklin, we received your message and your request for money, and we want you to know that we know that you're broke. We know that you can't pay the interest, let alone the loan, and you're broke. But we have even more bad news. We, the French, are broke. The king is broke. We're broke because we have a famine. We have people hate, we have all these tax exempt groups. The Catholic Church isn't paying their fair share, et cetera, et cetera." He lists all of these problems. So he says, and very somberly, he says, "Dr. Franklin, I'm sorry, but we cannot loan you 25 million livres." But then he paused, and then he said, "But because of the love you have for the French people, and because the King of France, Louis XVI, had love he has for you, he has decided to give you, not as a loan, but as a free gift, 6 million livres out of his own personal account."
Wow.
Well, Nick and Dara and Mark, you know what we call this? Fundraising.
Well, that's great.
Noted for our nonprofit.
In today's world, everybody's a fundraiser. And by the way, Franklin invented matching funds. Did you guess how he did that?
No.
Yeah, he was raising money for the first public hospital in Philadelphia. He's very active in civic affairs. And he said, "We need a hospital." And he went to the legislature and he said, "Listen, can you grant," I think it was £4,000 to build this hospital. And they said, "Dr. Franklin, we're broke. We can't afford it. And we know that this isn't going to work." So Franklin says, "Hey, I'll tell you what, if I can personally raise £2,000 myself, will you match it?" So we come up with the 4,000. He said, "Yeah, you go ahead and you try that because we know it's not going to work." Well, Franklin came back a few months later and he had raised the 2,000 pounds. And so he invented the matching, which is used.
Wow.
He's the father of the matching fund in philanthropy.
That's great.
So anyway, that's a long story for talking about dealing with paper money and the problems he had associated with it and the bankruptcies. And, every war in the United States has been inflationary. This war is no exception. There's this wonderful chart that Reinhard and Rogar from Harvard, the two Harvard economists, came together showing inflation since 1776 in the United States based on the Consumer Price Index. And if I had the chart, I'd show it to you, but it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. And it goes up during wars and then comes back down after wars, 5 or 6 times, including the Civil War. But then after World War II, guess what? Never comes back down. After World War II, inflation, we've entered an era of permanent inflation. And I ask my students, I say, so what are the reasons? At Chapman, I teach and I show this chart to my students. So how do we get this hockey stick phenomenon with inflation? What are the reasons? And I give them 5 choices. I said, never-ending wars, that's a possibility. The creation of the Federal Reserve, the engine of inflation, going off the gold standard, adopting Keynesian economics and deficit spending, permanent deficit spending, or the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 that made the fiat dollar the world's currency. Which of those 5? And of course, the answer is all of the above.
I was going to say, you're having all the above.
But it is interesting. There's so many categories that's causing not runaway inflation, but 2 to 3 to 4%, sometimes 5% inflation. It never goes down. And that's something Franklin would be quite shocked if he came back. He always wanted to come back 200 or 300 years later, and he would be thoroughly impressed with the capital markets. Oh my gosh. Despite the efforts of the SEC and government agencies to overregulate and so on, he would be so impressed with especially the SpaceX thing, because he loved the idea of traveling in space. He said, I can't wait to get to heaven because I get to travel in space. He actually said that.
Wow.
Well, he was quite visionary in so many ways. But one thing he would not be happy with is the size of the national debt and the permanent inflation that we're suffering from, because he ultimately did believe in stable money. So he and Adam Smith were very converged on many issues of limited government, stable money, laissez-faire, free trade, open immigration, liberal immigration, I would say. There are so many areas where Franklin supported Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which this year we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of that book too. So this year we're celebrating the Declaration of Political Independence with Thomas Jefferson, which Franklin helped write, the Declaration of Independence. And then there's Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was the Declaration of Economic Independence, both in the very same year of the Enlightenment. So it's really quite something.
Yeah.
Those are amazing stories. I love that. You mentioned also earlier that Benjamin Franklin really was a big proponent of saving. So what do you think he would think of Keynesian economics and just the outrageous spending and at the expense of saving?
He was not a Keynesian economist. He's one of America's earliest economists. He was not a Keynesian economist. He was not a big spender at any time. And in fact, he argued that it's during the prosperous times that you should be saving even more instead of spending more. Well, you could do both, actually, but you don't want to get into a situation where when the hard times hit that you've run out of money and you have a cash flow problem. So he was a strong advocate of saving and very anti-debt. I mean, he's constantly, and poor Richard's all constantly complaining about creditors have better memories than debtors, and a penny saved is a penny earned. So he was very much an advocate. So he was not a Keynesian in the same sense of Keynes, of spending your money into prosperity. He would be opposed to that. But he was probably more of a monetarist inflationist in the sense that the Real Bills Doctrine, expand money supply equal to the expansion of the economy. So he's not a hard money man, particularly. I would say that would be the case. He's not a big fan of gold and silver. In fact, it would please his vanity to know. In fact, I think I've got one of these here. It would please his vanity to know that he's worth 100 times more than the founder of our country.
Right.
Wow.
Benjamin.
That's great.
Yeah, that's 100 times. I mean, that would really please his vanity for sure. And he's the only non-president on the American currency.
That's a good point.
But this idea of spending your money, running deficits and stuff, he realized it was necessary in wartime. Whatever it would take to win the American Revolution, but it was not something he would want to see in. He wants capital to come out of savings, not from printing money. So he would be more of a classical economist in that regard.
Mark, you mentioned the time value of money. So was it Franklin who was centuries ahead of his time with interest and compound interest? And is it true that his will provided for some way to lock money away for 200 years? And if so, that would be quite an unusual financial instrument today.
Yeah, money begets money is what poor Richard said. And he actually got this idea of actually giving £1,000 to the city of Boston, where he was born, and then in Philadelphia, where he lived most of his life. £1,000 to the city for the first 100 years. He wanted to prove the value of compounding. There's no question about that. That was his whole purpose. So he loved the idea of the compounding of interest. Earning interest on interest is how that's achieved. So he first of all said the first 100 years, money should be loaned to artisans and trades, people in trades, at 5% as a loan, not as a gift, as a loan that they would pay back. And then after 100 years of doing that, to helping artisans and people with these trades, developing their skills and so forth, being successful in business, as was he, as a printer. He said after 100 years, then you would start investing, the cities would invest this money in infrastructure, bridges, roads, hospitals, whatever would be useful for public infrastructure. And perhaps you could invest monies also in savings accounts, bank CDs, and very conservative investing, which is what both cities did. However, they weren't as successful as they should have been, because if they had just invested the money at 5% return for 200 years, that £1,000 would be worth $15 million. It turned out that Boston had $5 million left after 200 years, and Philadelphia only $2 million. Still substantial amounts, demonstrating the power of compounded interest. So long-term investing is very much a part of his strategy, and not so much short-term speculation. He did engage in speculation, but only because he was financially successful. And let me also mention, I don't know if you wanted to bring this up or not on terms of personal finance, but his career in personal finance is really valuable for individuals to see. So what happened was he concentrated, to make it, you concentrate, to keep it, you diversify, right? That's the standard policy approach to investing. And so he concentrated on the printing business, was very successful at it, always keeping up with the latest technology. He would get the best print presses from England. He was always developing new ways to diversify and franchise his business. He actually had franchises of his printing in other countries. In other colonies. He made he spread his, I don't know how to say this. The Pennsylvania Gazette was kind of the New York Times of its era. So he made it available. People would read this in Boston and in New York and other major cities. So he spread he franchised his businesses in that respect and expanded that business. So he was so successful that at age 42 he retired, and he got £1,000 a year, more or less, according to estimates, from David Hall, his partner who took over the printing business. So he was getting a royalty. And then on top of that, he became the deputy postmaster general, the first postmaster general in the post office. And he was getting, I think, £300 a year, something like for that. And then he went in 1757, he became the colonial agent, representing ultimately 4 colonies: Massachusetts, New Jersey, I think North Carolina, or no, Georgia, and then Pennsylvania. So 4, and he was paid £400 or £500 each. So he was getting £1,500 a year when the average worker was getting less than £50 a year.
Wow.
So this guy was really, he's one of those billionaires of the era, if you will.
Right.
And he saved a lot of his money and was well diversified. He had several bank accounts. He had several rental properties in Philadelphia. He loaned money out, but was very careful in the money that he loaned. And so that kind of diversified portfolio really served him well. Unfortunately, in January of 1774, because of the Hutchison letters scandal, which we may not want to go into, but basically his colonial agency was canceled. So the British ultimately stopped paying him. So he was going from £1,500 down to like 300 or something, a very small amount, just on his rental properties and things like that. He was not getting earned income after that. But he had saved so much money and was well diversified that he was financially independent for the rest of his life, despite losing suddenly all of his earning power of £1,500 a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something pretty admirable.
Yeah. Yeah. Prudent investing. It's fun trying to imagine what would Franklin think about whatever topic today. And given, we've talked about his role in making paper currency and his views on inflation and debt. So we happen to be talking in a time when Bitcoin has been invented, and there are lots of cryptocurrency imitators of Bitcoin. What do you suppose he would have made of that? I mean, these are essentially private currencies that can be designed in whatever way the creator of the currency wants to design them. Would he have been in favor of private currencies or not sort of fiat government currencies, you suppose?
Well, he wanted a stable monetary system, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And so I think he would be wary of the possible. He's certainly familiar with the tulip mania of the era and the Mississippi bubble. Those are examples of runaway inflation and speculative bubbles. And he was very conservative in his approach. So I think he would be a bit skeptical of Bitcoin that is just limited by its supply. So it's dependent entirely on whether people are going to accept it or not. I think he would have some sympathy with it. Certainly when Bitcoin can be used for private transactions, to transfer money out of Venezuela if you have a suppressive government and so forth. But it's really hard to answer these kinds of questions in that respect. Yeah. I mean, for example, would he favor, should drugs be legal or illegal? Well, in his day, I mean, he used, it's not heroin. It was the other, I'm trying to think of the other drug that he used because he had the gout and he had the kidney stone and so forth. And so he used drugs. Drugs were totally legal back then. And there were ways to reduce pain and so forth that he engaged in. I mean, we just don't know a lot of things, what he would think about gay rights or what he would think about transgenders or what he would think about abortion. There's so many of these cultural issues, although culturally, while he was famous for being a ladies' man, and some would say a womanizer, certainly John Adams and Abigail Adams, who were puritanical in their views, had very negative views about Franklin's escapades with women. He did have an illegitimate child, so he does talk in his autobiography of his hard to govern passions. But he did become more of a devoted husband after that, and he did leave his wife to go to be a colonial agent in England, but that's only because his wife had an extreme aversion to getting on the high seas. It's kind of like people were afraid to fly airplanes and stuff like that. So they did become somewhat estranged in that respect. But overall, he was one of the first who really appreciated women for their intellect and not just their beauty. That was rare back in those days. And he learned a lot of that from the French, because the salons were all run by French women. Madame Helvétius, Madame Brionne, people like that held these salon meetings that were very intellectual. But of course, one time Adams, I should back up a little bit. Franklin, at the age of 70, he was appointed to be the ambassador and to raise money from the French. So he went to Paris and he was treated like royalty. I mean, because of his scientific contributions, he was the most famous American at that time. But he was 70 years old. And so the Congress didn't trust Franklin that he could do his job. So they sent over 5 commissioners. They sent over the Lee brothers, William and Arthur Lee. They sent over Ralph Echard. They sent over Silas Deane. They sent over John and Abigail Adams. Here's the interesting thing. Franklin was the only one who loved the French people and they loved him. The rest of them hated the French, even though they were commissioners. And Franklin raised all the money, all the armaments, all the uniforms, sent over the generals. He did it all himself. So while Washington won the war at home, Franklin really won the war abroad, and he deserves to be on the $100 bill in that respect, because of all the fundraising that he did and stuff like that. But there's this one scene in the salons where Madame Helvétius was, they were very demonstrative, very loving people. Franklin loved that. And so they treated Franklin royalty, and they'd put his arms around him and they'd be kissing him and stuff like that. Well, the Adamses were just incensed at this behavior, this bad behavior of Franklin. They became kind of bitter enemies, unfortunately, at the end of their lives. In fact, when Franklin died, Adams was part of the Senate and vice president stuff, and the House honored him extravagantly, Franklin, for his contribution, but the Senate waited a whole year before they paid a tribute, and even chose an enemy of Franklin to pay the tribute. So it's kind of sad what happened, but John Adams was that way, but he got along with Jefferson, loved George Washington. He got along with pretty much everybody except for Adams and a few other. He did have enemies. I mean, if you don't do anything, you don't have enemies if you don't do anything, you don't have enemies, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's a good way to avoid getting enemies.
Yes, that's right.
One thing that you had mentioned, you talked a little bit about diversification, which is so interesting because he also had so many forward-thinking ideas with respect to insurance and diversifying within that field and really setting new precedents for that entire industry to emerge. Do you think I think it would be interesting to hear your insights a little bit on that aspect of it, and how was that really kind of the precursor to, because diversification really became the only, I would say it's the only theory that was really tried and true, that that was the only way to now for investment portfolios that people really rely on it. Do you think that was a precursor to modern portfolio theory? And if so, why did it take so long? Because
Yeah, I did a little research on the fire insurance company. You got to remember that Franklin was involved with many civic affairs. When he retired at 70 or at 42, he didn't just play golf all day, uh, or basically retire. He was very active as a legislator, civil citizen. He started the first public private library, first public hospital. He became the University of Pennsylvania. He did all of these kinds of things. And one of the things was he was very concerned about fire. So the insurance company that he decided was a fire insurance company. It wasn't a life insurance company, because the biggest fear people had was fires at the time. I mean, just all the time, because you have to remember that lightning struck 3 times more frequently in the United States in the colonies that it did in England. So this was a major problem in Philadelphia. And of course, he invented he did 2 things. One was the Franklin stove. He made that more secure and more productive, more efficient Franklin stove. And then the lightning rod, with his experiments in electricity, discovered the need for the invention of the lightning rod, which saved so many homes, including his own home. He set it up, and when he returned from Paris, he found out that his home lightning had struck his home, but because of the lightning rod, it prevented a fire. So he did that, but you still had fires. And so he worked with a group of investors and created, it's actually doesn't have the word insurance in it. It's called the Philadelphia Contributorship. Contributor, I think. No, Contributionship. It's a kind of a strange name. And notice the time when he did this, 1752. So this 10 years after, or a few years after he retired. And so he recognized the need for this. And the whole idea was to manage risk. And this was, this is underwriting. Basically, he developed this idea of underwriting, and you would not automatically insure all the properties. You would assess the property to see, well, how much risk is there of fire damage? Do you have a lightning rod at the top? Are you doing things to protect yourself from, do you have wood or do you have stone, for example, in your building? And it was commercial buildings too. It wasn't just private homes that were being insured there. So the idea of managing and combining risk, and therefore the basic insurance policy is that you only have to pay out a few people who suffer from fires, and so you can have a profitable company. I mean, that's quite another. We could add that to Franklin's inventions, I think.
Yeah. Gosh, he did so much. I am mindful of the time. Why don't I pose one final anachronistic question that may be impossible to answer?
Okay.
So, we're at ICANN, we're focused very much on the regulation of capital markets, and specifically the over-regulation of capital markets, SEC and elsewhere. So Franklin, I think, kind of over summarizing what you've described, spent his life expanding access to opportunity through money, finance, the insurance example you just gave, education, entrepreneurship. You suppose, and this is total speculation and it's anachronistic like we discussed, but is there an area of current regulation you think he would find most in need of reform in the modern era? Or is that just too hard to answer?
I do think that he would be an advocate of setting the rules, the how the game is played, basic ideas. But I think he would be appalled by the excessive regulation. Franklin was very much in the Adam Smith model during the era of, he had a copy of The Wealth of Nations, and he helped edit The Wealth of Nations, as Franklin was, or as Adam Smith was in London for a couple of years when Franklin was there. And Adam Smith would go around with chapters in his book and help and say, hey, could you take a look at what I've written here? Can you give some suggestions and that sort of thing? Kind of Now, he never had an acknowledgments page like you see today in books. So this is only based on hearsay evidence that Franklin told a friend that that's exactly what happened. Franklin had a great deal of influence on Adam Smith and vice versa. So one of the reasons The Wealth of Nations is so pro-America and pro-independence, by the way, very controversial at that time, was, I believe, because of Franklin's influence. But Adam Smith also influenced Ben Franklin because you had that mercantilist overregulation, which Adam Smith was very critical of. I mean, the whole purpose of the book was to condemn the monopolies, the minute details. For example, you actually had to ask permission to move from one city to another back in Adam Smith's day. Yeah, it was that specific in terms of regulations and so forth. And so he was in favor of deregulation on a massive scale. So Franklin says the same thing. He once says, he writes a friend, he says, a virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed. And I think he's also meaning limited small government. And in another place, he says, laissez-faire, do not leave us alone. That French philosophy of the physiocrats that Adam Smith was also, because he spent some time in France before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. Franklin also said the system of America is commerce with all and war with none. He was a free trader. He said no nation was ever ruined by trade, even the most disadvantageous. So that's a far cry different from our current president who says we've been ripped off by X, Y, and Z countries and stuff like that. He said, no, the consumers certainly have been better off and in so many ways from free trade. And the United States has become the commercial center, the globalization. We're the ones responsible for globalization because we bought products from everybody. Franklin would be a big supporter of that kind of thing and limited regulation. He's not an anarchist. He's not one who says just let the New York Stock Exchange make up their own rules and stuff like that, although he would certainly favor that kind of private rulemaking by the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange and so forth. So, but the minutia, the rules on insider trading and all that sort of thing, I think he would push back on that, generally speaking, from what I've read. I mean, one of the reasons, if you read the Declaration of Independence, which Franklin signed, he also signed the Constitution, one of 6 individuals who did both. But if you look at the list of things in the Declaration, I mean, agents swarming to harass the people, that sounds like what the SEC did after the Bernie Madoff scandal, which they blew, which they in the Bernie Madoff scandal, the SEC, they audited Bernie Madoff's company twice and found no wrongdoing. And then they had the audacity to ask for double or triple their budget after the Bernie Madoff scandal. And what did they do with that money? They went after legitimate companies, hedge funds, and private equity firms in New York, and they went through their records and their emails, and it was extremely expensive. I don't know if any of you are aware of what they did in that, but they found nothing. You know, it was the sin of omission moving toward a sin of commission. And it was really, I think, an unfortunate trend in that respect. So I think in general, Franklin was, we want to maximize freedom and entrepreneurship and innovation within the rule of law and a robust competitive model. And that's the Adam Smith model, the system of natural liberty. He'd very much be in favor of the Economic Freedom Index, which is done by the Fraser Institute and the Heritage Foundation. I don't know if you're familiar with those indexes, but they basically show the more freedom that you give individuals in countries, the more they flourish, they have a higher standard of living. There's a lot to be said in that regard. So I guess if I could kind of sum up why I call Ben Franklin the greatest American, I look at these surveys, like Forbes just came out with the 250 most innovative Americans history. Franklin's number 2. There's a book. There's a book called 101 Philosophers. Franklin's number 93. There's the 100 most influential scientists. Franklin's number 19 for his electricity experiments. In the wealthy 100, he's one of the top wealthiest people in the world in terms of the values and stuff like that. And in diplomacy, he's number one in diplomacy, and we certainly could learn from Ben Franklin today. So I'm hoping all your listeners who are interested would take a look at my book, The Greatest American, the world's most versatile genius. I came up with 22 careers, and I need to add a new one, insurance company.
Right. Innovator. Yeah.
Innovator.
Yeah.
That would be number 23. But
Right.
it's truly amazing. I mean, Elon Musk might have 2 or 3 different occupations, but Ben Franklin, 22 occupations.
Hard to imagine. Not,
Yeah.
not enough time in the day. I don't know how you did it. I mean, Mark, Professor Skousen, this has been super fascinating. And I do recommend for those who want to know more about Ben Franklin, anyone should go out and buy your book and give it a read. I think it's pretty clear from your summary, and Ben Franklin makes it clear that economic success is not accidental. It's something that, can be created by the right institution, expanded community.
Let me just mention one other thing about my book. It's not a typical biography. There's a lot. Walter Isaacson and H.L. Brands and other historians have done great jobs in writing full-scale biographies of Ben Franklin. Mine's 80 chapters of applying Franklin to business, philosophy, investing, economics, diplomacy, war. And I even have a chapter. In fact, this was based, I wrote a series of columns for this book for Newsmax. It's called the Franklin Prosperity Report. And one column they rejected. They said, no, our conservative boss, this chapter's too salacious. So what do you think the topic was?
I don't know, womanizing?
Yep, sex. So the sex chapter is chapter 77 in my book. I included that in the book. So for those who want to see his views on his hard to govern passions, that's in there. And I also have a bunch of other chapters that I think people will really like. So anyway, it's called The Greatest American. And I think I've gotten some very good response from people who say, yeah, you can pick up and read any chapter, but each chapter stands on its own. So it's kind of a fun book to read.
That sounds totally appropriate for a book about Ben Franklin, who was very readable. That's the way he wrote. So, well, thank you so much for joining us, Mark. I really appreciate it. Thank you, as always, to Dara and Mark for co-hosting. Thank you for the listeners for tuning in to Capital Ideas. If you want to learn more about Investor Choice Advocates Network, go to icanlaw.org, and we'll see you on the next Capital Ideas.